Hello. This time, as we continue to look at size and resolution, we are going to talk about what that means when we try to print something out on a piece of paper. In the previous videos, you have seen me talk about size and resolution and show you the effects it has on screen. If you remember, we would have a low resolution image. I would make it larger in Photoshop, and as it got larger, you started to see the pixels. That works for screens. We're going to talk now about how it works for print. Now, before we go too far into this, I just want to let you know that this is even a little bit more complicated, and there are some areas about printing out and resolution that I'm not even going to bring up. Don't worry though, we will talk more about this throughout the course. And if you're going to take classes at Mount San Antonio College, graphic design classes, then you will get experience with that even more. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the basics, the kinds of things that you need to know to make sure that you get the best printout possible. And then we're going to end with one single rule that I want to put into effect for this course. All right, so let's take a look at this. You see I have on my screen, on my canvas here, a piece of paper. Actually, it's not a piece of paper, it represents a piece of paper. If you remember our Eagle images, we had a low resolution version, a medium resolution version, and a high resolution version. And so what we want to do is take a look at these and understand how that resolution relates to printing it out on a piece of paper. Now, the important thing, or the first important thing to understand, is that different devices require different resolution of the image in order to look its best. I'll say that again. Different devices require different resolutions in order for the print to look the best it possibly can with that device. For example, if you have an inkjet printer and you want to print an image out, say the Eagle image, you want to print that Eagle image out on an inkjet printer, that inkjet printer is going to want a certain pixels per inch, and it's going to tell you in the manual or something like that. So let's just say, for example, it's going to want to see 150 pixels per inch. Well, that means that on the piece of paper, every inch, it's going to lay down a density, compressed, a density of those pixels, 150 of them, for every inch. That's what per means, for every. So what it's saying is, for every inch, I'm going to lay down, or I'm going to need, the printer's talking here, for every inch, I'm going to need you to put down 150 pixels or more, but at least 150 pixels in order for the image you're printing to look the best that I can print. That's kind of how the printer is going to think. All right, now, an inkjet printer might want 150 pixels per inch. That's probably not a problem for us. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But say a printing press, you're going to get it professionally printed at some offset printing company, they're going to require 300 pixels per inch. Okay, so what you're seeing here in the comparison between the two is that the inkjet printer, in order to print the best it can print, which by the way isn't as good as an offset printer in most cases, which is why the offset printer needs more pixels because it can print better. Okay, so anyway, back to the comparison. The inkjet printer, in order to print the best it can print, is going to want to see 150 pixels per inch at least. Now, anything more than that is fine. You get a bigger file, but it doesn't make any difference. It's still going to look good. So you can go higher resolution, but not lower. If you go lower than that stated 150 pixels per inch, it is not going to look as good as it could. Follow? So if we take that and we want to print that same image out at the offset print company, they want 300 pixels per inch. So instead of putting 150 pixels per inch, they're going to want you, or I should say it, the printer is saying, I want you to print 300 pixels per inch. So it's denser. It's actually twice as dense. Okay, so let's take a look at that and maybe you'll see what I mean. Here is the medium resolution image. I'm going to take a look at the image size and you'll notice that the pixels, the total pixels wide is 1242. The total pixels tall is 734. And notice the setting right here is an output setting. It is saying, hey, I'm ready to print out at 300 pixels per inch. I'm ready for that. You can change this number, but before we do, we want to uncheck resample, because if you remember in the previous video, I said that resample adds or subtracts or takes away pixels. We don't want to do that. Very rarely do we want to do that. We can always take away sometimes, and we might have a purpose for that. But very rarely do we want to add pixels, because if you remember, it doesn't do a very good job at that. So we uncheck the resample, and what that means is when we uncheck resample, it's telling Photoshop we don't want to change the total number of pixels across and the total number of pixels down. And when I do that, you'll see that the units of measure change to inches, and you'll notice that at 300 pixels per inch, it's going to take these 1242 pixels and it's going to print them out at 4 inches, 0.14. Now, if you were to do the math, you could figure this out, meaning that if the printer is going to print out 300 pixels for every inch, as it's going across the printing, it prints out 300 pixels, and then there's something like 900 pixels left. Then it prints out 300 more pixels, and then there's 600 pixels left. Then it prints out 300 more pixels, and we've got to 3 inches so far, and then there's 300 and some odd pixels left, and then it prints out that last inch, and there's a few pixels left, and that's a total of 4 inches. There's a few pixels left, and now we're left with 0.14 inches, so it goes out 0.14 inches, and it finishes printing all the pixels out in that particular space on the printer. Okay, I know, it's crazy, but stay with me. Watch what happens if I change this to 150. Notice I can print it out bigger. The total pixel resolution doesn't change. Again, we're not changing that. The total pixel resolution stays the same. We're just telling Photoshop to print it out differently. Take those total pixels and either put them in a smaller space, which we did with 300 pixels, or a larger space, which we're doing now at 150 pixels. So in this particular case, we're saying, hey, Photoshop, print this out every inch 150 pixels instead of 300 pixels. So if you travel 150, it prints. It's still got 7 and some odd inches to go. So there you have it, if you can kind of continue with that. You can see here that the lower the resolution, which means the more pixels are spread out, the bigger you can print. But remember, there is a requirement by the printing device, the printing press or the inkjet printer. And so when you look up the inkjet printer and the inkjet printer says it has to be 150 pixels per inch, you come into image size and you uncheck resample and you type in the resolution of 150, and you'll see in the width and height how big you can go. Now remember, you can go smaller, but you'll see that the maximum width and height of this particular image I can go at 150 pixels per inch is 8.28 inches across and 4.893 inches down. If I'm printing it at the printing press and I type 300 here because that's what the printing press wants, you'll see that I can only go 4.14 inches. Now, one last thing here before I kind of give you an example. Let's take a look at the high resolution file, and you'll see that we have more options here because there's 4,968 pixels going across. So if I uncheck the resample, you'll see that at 300 pixels per inch, since this is a much higher resolution, I can go bigger at 300 pixels per inch. If I go to 150 pixels per inch and print it out on an inkjet printer, you can see that I can go up to 33 inches wide with this thing. So that's how it's working in printing. So let me show you here. I'm going to come over here to Eagle Low Resolution. And I have on this printing piece of paper, represents a 17 by 11 inch paper, and I want to take this low resolution image and print it out on the 17 inch by 11 inch paper. So I'm going to drop this on the piece of paper. So I'm going to Command A, which selects all, Command C, which copies, go to my document here and just Command V, and you'll notice that that's the size that it comes in at 150 pixels per inch. If I was to print it out on a 17 by 11 paper that the printer required 300 pixels per inch, then it would be that big would be the maximum I could go. All right, so let's take a look at the medium resolution one. Here it is, the medium resolution. I'm going to Command A, Command C, go to the 150 pixels per inch paper and paste it, and that's how big that would print out maximum on a 150 pixel per inch required printer. If I go to the 300, the printing press, I paste it, and that is what the size is. Let's take a look at that high resolution one. Command A, Command C. Here's the 150 pixels per inch paper. Now, if you remember what we saw, it's going to print out at 33 inches wide, which is way bigger than my paper. Watch. Boom. Wow. If we go here on the 300 pixel per inch required printer, we print it out there, and that's how big it'll go. Okay, I know it's kind of confusing, but hopefully you got an idea about how this works. So the important thing for you to remember at this stage is simply that different devices require different output resolution that is measured in pixels per inch. You can figure out how large your image can go maximum by going into the image size option, uncheck resample, and then tell Photoshop what the resolution is that you require, or what the resolution is that output device requires. Type that in there, and you can see in the width and height the maximum width and maximum height you can go. And remember, that's a maximum height. You can always go smaller, but what you can't do is something like this. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to turn these off and target the layer here, layer 1, and that's this small low resolution image that I pasted. And this is a page that requires 150 pixels per inch. And so I paste this in there and I go, whoa, it's really small. Yeah, it's really small. But remember in the last video when we had Photoshop make it bigger? Well, we can't make it bigger without that. In other words, you guys know how to transform by now. So I can transform this and I can make this bigger, but it's not going to look very good. Because as you zoom in, you see how ugly, there's no detail. It does what we saw happened last video when we did this enlargement. We had Photoshop add pixels. So you can't enlarge. You can't make it bigger. That's a rule that we are going to use in this class. You will get graded down if you do that. You need to start with the resolution that you need, okay? That makes sense? In other words, you think about how big it needs to be and what the final resolution requirements are, and then you can calculate that. But even if you don't calculate that, if you ever paste something in and it's too small, what I'm basically saying to you is don't make it bigger. You have to do something else. Either get a higher resolution image of that same thing or take a new picture or whatever. And we'll talk more about how to solve that problem. But what you cannot do is enlarge it. Now, one qualifier with that, real professional Photoshop people, if you're one of them or if somebody's watching this video, I realize that there are certain circumstances that you can make it bigger, and Photoshop does an adequate job in certain circumstances, but I don't want you thinking like that. I want you to have to deal on a daily basis, or however often you are using Photoshop, with not enlarging images, thinking about what size you need. If it's a little fuzzy, don't worry about it. Just remember this, don't resize up. Okay? See you next time.